Grant picked up his tool bag from the floor and slung it over his shoulder. It was heavy, the way it always was at the start of a long shift, full of wrenches and wire cutters and small spare parts that clinked together when he walked. He did not mind the weight. He had carried it for years. The lower maintenance level of Ember Reach was not a place most people chose to spend their time. It was narrow and dimly lit, with long corridors that smelled of warm metal and old circuitry. The ceiling was low in some sections, and the walls were lined with thick bundles of cable and pipe that hummed quietly with power. It was not a beautiful place. But Grant knew every corner of it, every loose panel and every flickering light, and that familiarity made it feel like home to him. He had been working on Ember Reach for 3 years. He was one of only a handful of humans assigned to the station, brought in as part of a joint technical agreement between Earth and the Vrethkai Collective. The Vrethkai were an ancient and proud species. They stood taller than humans, their skin a deep gray with faint patterns of amber light that pulsed slowly beneath the surface like embers buried under ash. They were not unkind, but they were formal. They valued tradition and rank, and they did not warm to strangers easily. Grant had learned early on not to push. He did his work, kept his head down, and stayed out of matters that did not concern him. That was how he had earned a quiet kind of respect on the station. Not friendship, exactly. But a steady and comfortable distance that suited him just fine. He turned down Corridor 7 and crouched beside a panel on the lower wall. The relay inside had been running warm for 2 days, and he had been meaning to check it. He pulled the panel open with a flat tool and shone his small light inside, squinting at the tangle of components within. Above him, several floors up, Ember Reach was falling apart. The flame-born enclosure was one of the most protected spaces on the entire station. The Vrethkai kept young Flameborn in a specially built chamber near the upper residential level, a large room lined with heat-resistant stone and warmed to a precise temperature. The Flameborn were sacred creatures. They were not pets and they were not weapons. They were something older than both. The Vrethkai had raised them for generations, and the bond between a Flameborn and its keeper was considered one of the most honorable things a Vrethkai could ever know. There were 5 young Flameborn in the enclosure. That morning, when the keeper arrived to begin the daily care routine, 3 of them were gone. The doors had not been opened. The sensors had not been triggered. There was no sign of how they had left or where they had gone. They were simply missing, as if the station had swallowed them whole. The keeper raised the alarm within minutes. By the time the Elder Council was informed, the news had already spread through the upper decks like fire through dry grass. Vrethkai officers moved quickly through the corridors, their amber patterns burning bright with urgency. Security teams were deployed to every level. Every door was sealed. Every passenger and crew member was stopped and questioned. The shame of it was immense. Losing a young Flameborn was not simply an accident. It was a failure. It meant that something had gone wrong in a place where nothing was supposed to go wrong. The elders gathered in the council chamber with tight expressions and low voices, speaking carefully about what this meant and what needed to be done. The station was locked down within the hour. Grant did not know any of this. He was deep inside the relay panel, carefully disconnecting a burnt component with steady hands. The lower maintenance level had its own hum, its own rhythm, and it blocked out a great deal of the noise from above. The internal communication channel on his earpiece had been crackling all morning, which was not unusual. Old wiring near the power junctions often caused interference. He had made a note to check it later. He replaced the component, reconnected the wiring, and closed the panel. He stood up slowly, pressing one hand to his lower back as he straightened. The corridor stretched ahead of him, quiet and warm. He checked his list. 3 more stops before his midday break. He started walking. He had gone perhaps 50 steps when he noticed something. There was a smell. Faint, but distinct. It reminded him of burning cedar wood, or the moment just before a fire catches, that dry and woody warmth that sits in the air before the flame appears. He stopped and stood still, turning his head slightly. It was coming from the left. From the direction of storage alcove 4. Grant frowned. Alcove 4 was used for spare insulation rolls and old equipment that had not yet been catalogued for removal. Nothing in there should be producing heat. He walked to the alcove door and pressed his palm to the surface. It was warm. Not burning, but noticeably warmer than it should have been. He typed in his access code and pulled the door open. The inside of the alcove was dark. He raised his light and swept it slowly across the space. At the back, behind a stack of old insulation rolls, 3 pairs of eyes caught the light and glowed back at him. Bright and amber, like small flames behind glass. For a moment, nobody moved. Grant stood in the doorway with his light raised, and the 3 creatures at the back of the alcove sat perfectly still, watching him. They were small. Each one was roughly the size of a large dog, covered in scales that shifted between deep red and burnt orange, with faint lines of gold running along their sides. Their tails curled around their bodies and their wings were pressed flat against their backs. They were young, clearly. Their scales did not yet have the full depth of color that adult flameborn carried, and their eyes were wide in the way that young animals' eyes always are, full of uncertainty and something very close to fear. Grant lowered his light slowly. He did not move forward. He did not make a sound. He simply looked at them, and they looked at him, and the alcove was very quiet. He did not know what they were called. He did not know that an entire station was being turned upside down searching for them. He did not know that their disappearance had shaken one of the proudest species in the known galaxy to its core. All he knew, standing in that doorway with the warm cedar smell drifting around him, was that these 3 creatures were frightened and exhausted and very far from wherever they were supposed to be. He took one slow step back. Then he reached into his tool bag and pulled out the small wrapped sandwich he had packed for his midday break. He set it gently on the floor just inside the door. Then he stepped back again, and waited. The smallest one moved first. It crept forward slowly, keeping its body low to the ground, its scales shifting from deep red to a cautious amber as it moved. Its nose touched the wrapped sandwich Grant had placed on the floor, pulled back, then touched it again. The other 2 stayed where they were, watching from behind the insulation rolls with wide and careful eyes. Grant did not move. He stood just outside the doorway with his arms loose at his sides and his breathing slow and steady. He had learned a long time ago, back home on Earth, that frightened things needed time. His grandfather had kept animals on a small farm, and the old man had always said the same thing. Do not reach. Do not rush. Just be still and let them decide. The small one nosed the sandwich open and took a careful bite. Then another. Then it sat back and chewed slowly, still watching Grant with those wide amber eyes. Grant exhaled quietly. He reached up and pressed the alcove door so it sat mostly closed but not latched. Then he picked up his tool bag, turned around, and walked back down the corridor to finish his work. He told nobody. That first day, he thought about it constantly. Every time his communication earpiece crackled, he expected to hear a station-wide announcement, some instruction to report any unusual findings immediately. And there were announcements. Plenty of them. But the interference on the lower level was so heavy that he could only catch pieces of words, broken and unclear. He told himself he would find out what was happening once he got to a clearer section of the station. But by the time his shift ended and he was back in his small quarters, he had already made a quiet decision without fully admitting it to himself. He was going back to check on them first. He brought water the second morning. He had no idea if Flameborn drank water, but he filled a shallow metal tray from his supply kit and carried it down to Alcove 4 before his shift properly began. He opened the door carefully and set the tray inside without stepping in. All 3 of them were still there, awake and alert, their scales glowing faintly in the dark. The smallest one, the one that had come forward the day before, watched him set the tray down. It waited until Grant stepped back before it approached and sniffed at the water. Then it drank, in small and careful laps. After a moment the second one, slightly larger with darker scales along its back, came forward and drank as well. The third stayed back, curled tight, its wings pulled around its body like a shield. Grant noticed that one most. It had not eaten anything he could see. Its scales were dimmer than the other two, less bright, and it held itself in the careful way that something holds itself when it is trying not to show that it is hurting. He came back at midday. He had stopped by the station supply room during his morning rounds and quietly requisitioned a roll of heat-resistant padding, listing it on his work order under general maintenance use. He also took a second food portion from the crew canteen, something warm with a strong smell, hoping the Flameborn might find it more appealing than a cold sandwich. He laid the padding along the back wall of the alcove, making a low and soft base for them to rest on. The two braver ones watched him do it from a few feet away, their heads tilted slightly. When he finished and stepped back, the smallest one walked straight onto the padding, turned in a small circle, and lay down. The second one followed almost immediately. The third one did not move. Grant crouched down just inside the doorway and set the warm food near the third one, closer than he had placed anything before. He stayed low and still. The creature watched him with dull eyes. Up close, Grant could see a thin mark along its left side, between two scales, where the skin beneath looked raw and irritated. Not a serious wound, but enough to cause discomfort. Enough to make everything harder. He went back to his quarters that evening and found a small tube of the neutral healing salve that the station medical base stocked for minor burns and abrasions. It was standard issue, kept in every crew member's personal kit. He pocketed it without thinking too hard about what he was doing. On the third day, the third Flameborn let him get close enough to apply the salve. It had taken most of that morning's visit, Grant sitting quietly on the floor of the alcove just inside the door, not looking directly at it, letting it make the choice in its own time. When it finally moved toward him, slowly and with great uncertainty, and lowered its head near his hand, Grant applied the salve in one gentle and careful motion. The creature flinched once. Then it held still. Grant sat with them for a while after that. The alcove was warm, genuinely warm, the kind of warmth that came from the creatures themselves rather than the station systems. It was not unpleasant. It reminded him of sitting near a fireplace on a cold evening, that steady and surrounding heat that made everything feel slower and quieter. He started calling them by names inside his own head, then quietly out loud when he was alone with them. The smallest and bravest one was Spark. The larger one with the dark markings along its back was Ash. And the third one, the one that had taken the longest to trust him, the one with the healing mark along its side, he called Cinder. By the fourth day, Spark was climbing onto his tool bag every time he set it down. By the fifth day, Ash had started following him to the door of the alcove when he left, watching him go with an expression that Grant could only describe as reluctant. By the sixth day, Cinder pressed its warm side against Grant's leg while he sat on the floor, and stayed there for a long time without moving. Grant knew, with complete certainty, that he could not keep this quiet forever. The station had been in some kind of disruption for days. He had managed to catch enough of the announcements now to understand that something serious was happening, that a search was ongoing, that the upper levels were tense and sealed off in sections. He did not know the details yet. But he was not a foolish man. He could add things together. He sat on the floor of Alcove 4 on the evening of the sixth day with Spark curled across his lap, Ash pressed against his right side, and Cinder resting its head on his knee, its scales glowing a slow and peaceful amber in the dim light. The warm cedar smell filled the small space around him. He looked at the three of them and felt something settle in his chest. Something steady and certain. He was not going to hand them over to panic. He was not going to open the alcove door and wave a search team inside before these three small creatures had any idea what was coming. Whatever happened next, it was going to happen carefully and calmly and on terms that would not frighten them. He owed them that much. They had trusted him first. The announcement came on the 7th morning. Grant was in the middle of his breakfast when the communication channel cleared enough for him to hear it properly for the first time. The voice was formal and measured, the way Vrethkai voices always were when something serious was being addressed. It carried through the crew quarters without rushing, each word placed carefully, like stones being set into a wall. The missing Flameborn, the announcement said, had now been absent for 7 days. Young Flameborn separated from their handlers for extended periods were known to become unpredictable. Their internal heat, usually stable and controlled under proper care, could grow unregulated without the calming presence of a trained keeper. In extreme cases, the announcement said, an unstable young Flameborn could become a danger to itself and to those around it. All crew members were reminded to report any unusual heat signatures, unusual smells, or any sounds that could not be explained by normal station systems. Grant set his cup down slowly. He thought about Cinder pressing its warm side against his leg. He thought about Spark climbing onto his tool bag. He thought about Ash watching him leave each evening from the alcove door. None of them had shown a single sign of instability. They were calm. They were gentle. They were, if anything, getting more settled with each passing day, not less. But he also understood that he was not a Vrethkai keeper. He did not know everything about what these creatures needed. He did not know what was happening inside them that he could not see. The announcement unsettled him in a way he could not fully push aside, and he carried that unsettled feeling with him as he picked up his tool bag and headed down to the lower level. Commander Seville had been assigned to the search on the 4th day. She was a senior officer, tall even by Vrethkai standards, with deep gray skin and amber patterns that moved in sharp and precise lines rather than the slow drifting pulse that most Vrethkai carried. It meant she was focused. The crew had learned to read Vrethkai patterns the way they read expressions on a human face, and Seville's patterns, sharp and unbroken, meant her mind was working hard and working fast. She had already reviewed the search reports from every deck. She had already spoken to every crew member on the upper and middle levels. The lower maintenance corridors had been checked twice by junior teams, but the heat interference down there made scanner readings unreliable, and her junior officers had moved through quickly, not thoroughly. Seville did not consider that acceptable. She decided to go through the lower level herself, slowly, with her own eyes. She started on the 8th day. Grant did not see her at first. He was working near the junction of corridors 4 and 7, replacing a section of damaged conduit, when he heard footsteps behind him that did not sound like any of the maintenance crew he knew. He turned and found Commander Seville standing perhaps 10 feet away, watching him with those sharp amber patterns moving steadily across her skin. She asked him standard questions. How long had he been on this section of the level today? Had he noticed anything unusual in the past week? Any smells, any sounds, any unexplained warmth near panels or storage areas? Grant answered each question in the same calm and even tone he used for everything. No unusual sounds. No unexplained warmth. Nothing that had seemed out of place. He kept his eyes level and his hands relaxed and his voice flat and steady, the way he always spoke, and he answered only what she asked without adding anything extra. Seville watched him for a moment after he finished. Then she nodded once and moved on down the corridor. Grant turned back to the conduit and kept working. But his heart was beating a little faster than it had been before. She came back the next day. And the day after that. Each time she moved through the lower level she asked him something. Small questions, casual in tone, but placed carefully, the way someone places a hand on a wall to check if it is warm. She asked if he had needed to requisition any extra supplies recently. He said yes, standard maintenance items, nothing unusual. She asked what kind. He listed 3 or 4 real items from his recent work orders without hesitating, leaving the heat-resistant padding and the extra food portions unmentioned because they were buried in longer requisition lists and she would have to look carefully to find them. She would look carefully. He knew that. On the 10th day, Grant arrived at Alcove 4 in the early morning before his shift began, the way he always did now, and sat with the three Flameborn in the warm quiet of the small space. Spark climbed onto his lap immediately. Ash settled against his right side. Cinder, whose scales were now almost fully bright again, pressed close to his left and rested its chin on his knee. Grant sat with them and thought clearly for the first time in days about what was actually happening. The search had been running for 10 days. It was not going to stop. Commander Seville was not the kind of officer who stopped. The requisition lists would eventually be reviewed closely, and the heat-resistant padding would stand out to anyone who looked. The lower level could not hide three growing Flameborn forever. Their warmth was increasing as they grew more comfortable, their scales brighter, their movements less cautious, and a brighter Flameborn produced more heat, and more heat meant a greater chance that even the interference-heavy scanners would eventually pick up something they could not ignore. He also thought about the announcement. About the word unstable. He looked at Cinder's healed side and at Spark's bright curious eyes and at Ash sitting calmly beside him, and he did not believe for a moment that these three were dangerous. But he was not willing to gamble their safety on his own opinion alone. He did not know everything. He knew that. And underneath all of it, the thing he kept coming back to, the thing that sat heaviest in his chest, was this. If Seville or another search team found the alcove before he said anything, it would happen fast and loud and without warning. Doors would open. Lights would flood in. Voices would fill the space. And three creatures that had only just begun to feel safe would be surrounded in an instant by exactly the kind of panic and noise that he had spent 10 days carefully keeping away from them. He could not let that happen. He scratched Spark gently behind the small ridge above its ear. Spark made a low sound, something between a purr and a crackle, and pressed its head up into his hand. Grant made his decision. He would go to Commander Seville himself. Today. Before she came to the lower level for her daily walk. He would go to her directly, calmly, and he would explain everything. Not because he had run out of options, though he nearly had. But because it was the right thing to do, and because doing it himself, on his own terms, in his own time, was the only way he could make sure it happened quietly. He gave himself until the end of the morning. He sat a little longer in the warm alcove with the three of them settled against him, storing up the quiet before whatever came next. Then he picked up his tool bag, stood up slowly, and walked toward the corridor that led to the upper levels. Grant did not make it to the upper levels. He had barely reached the end of Corridor 7 when he heard footsteps coming toward him from the junction ahead. Measured footsteps, steady and unhurried, the kind that belonged to someone who knew exactly where they were going. He stopped walking. A moment later, Commander Seville came around the corner and stood at the far end of the corridor, looking directly at him. They looked at each other for a moment without speaking. Grant had spent the entire morning preparing what he was going to say. He had arranged the words carefully in his head, the right order, the right tone, calm and direct and honest. He had been ready to walk into her office and lay everything out plainly. But standing in the corridor with her amber patterns moving in those sharp precise lines across her skin, all of it left him at once. He said the only thing that came naturally. He said, "Follow me." Then he turned around and walked back the way he had come. There was a pause behind him. A long one. Long enough that he was not sure she was going to follow. Then he heard her footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming after him down the corridor. He led her to Alcove 4 without a word. He stopped outside the door and turned to face her. Her expression was unreadable in the way Vrethkai expressions often were to human eyes, but her patterns had changed. They were moving more slowly now, less sharp, which Grant had learned meant something between caution and surprise. He typed in his access code. The door opened. The alcove was warm. The cedar smell drifted out into the corridor immediately, soft and deep, the way it always was in the mornings when the three of them had been sleeping. Grant stepped inside and Seville followed one step behind him and stopped. Spark was curled across Grant's tool bag in the corner, fast asleep, its scales glowing a slow and steady amber. Ash was stretched along the back wall on the heat-resistant padding, one wing spread loosely to the side, breathing in the long and even rhythm of deep sleep. And Cinder, whose scales were now fully bright and rich with color, was lying directly across the folded blanket that Grant had brought down 4 days ago, its chin resting on its front legs, eyes closed, the faint line along its heeled side barely visible anymore beneath the warm glow of new scales. All three of them were completely at peace. Seville did not speak. She stood just inside the doorway and looked at the alcove and at the three sleeping Flameborn and at the careful small arrangements Grant had made for them, the padding and the water tray and the folded blanket, and she was perfectly still in a way that Grant had never seen a Vrethkai officer be still before. Not the stillness of control. The stillness of someone who has seen something they did not expect and have not yet found the words for. Grant sat down on the floor in his usual spot. Spark stirred at the small sound, opened its eyes, looked at him, and immediately began crawling across the alcove floor toward him with that familiar and unhurried confidence it always had. It climbed onto his lap and settled there, closed its eyes again, and went back to sleep within seconds. Ash lifted its head, saw Grant, made a low crackling sound, and put its head back down. Cinder opened its eyes fully, looked from Grant to Seville, looked back at Grant, then pressed itself a little closer to the blanket and stayed calm. Seville watched all of this without moving. Then she raised her communication device and spoke into it quietly. Her words were in formal Vrethkai, too fast and too precise for Grant to follow completely, but he caught enough. She was reporting to the Elder Council. She was telling them she had found the Flameborn. She was telling them where she was. She did not use the word dangerous. She did not use the word unstable. Grant noticed that. They came quickly. He could hear them before he saw them, footsteps filling the corridor outside the alcove, more than he could count. Voices, low and controlled but carrying the particular tension of people trying very hard to stay composed. The amber glow of Vrethkai patterns filled the narrow corridor outside the open door, shifting and pulsing with urgency. Ash sat up. Spark tightened on Grant's lap. Cinder pressed flat against the blanket and watched the doorway with wide eyes. Grant put one hand on Spark and kept his voice low. "It is all right," he said quietly, to no one in particular. "It is all right." The crowd outside the alcove door was large. Officers, council members, 2 Flameborn keepers in their formal grey robes, and at the front, standing just outside the doorway, a figure that carried a different kind of stillness than everyone around her. The High Tender was old, even by Vrethkai standards. Her skin was darker than most, nearly black, and the amber patterns on her face moved in wide and slow arcs, the kind that came with age and long experience. She wore no formal decoration except a single band of copper across her left wrist that caught the light when she moved. She stood at the doorway of the alcove and looked inside, and her eyes moved from Cinder to Ash to Spark, still curled and sleeping on Grant's lap, and then to Grant himself. The corridor was completely silent. The High Tender studied the scene for a long time. The warm cedar smell drifted out past her into the crowd. Nobody moved. Grant sat on the floor with his back against the wall and his hand resting gently on Spark and waited. When the High Tender finally spoke, her voice was quiet and unhurried. She asked how he had done it. How he had brought 3 wild and frightened young Flameborn to this. Sleeping. Calm. Trusting. She had kept Flameborn for 40 years, she said, and she had never seen a young one sleep on a stranger. She asked what he had used. What technique? What knowledge? What gift? The crowd behind her was absolutely still, waiting for the answer. Grant thought about it honestly for a moment. He thought about the sandwich on the floor. The water tray. The heat-resistant padding. The salve on Cinder's side. The morning sitting quietly on the floor without reaching or rushing. the evening staying a little longer than he needed to. He thought about his grandfather's farm and the old man's voice saying the same thing it had always said. Do not reach. Do not rush. Just be still and let them decide. He looked up at the high tender and gave her the only answer he had. He said he had not done anything. They were frightened and they were hurting and they needed someone to stay. So he stayed. That was all. He just stayed. The corridor was silent for a long time after that. The high tender looked at him without speaking. Her slow amber patterns moved across her face in wide and quiet arcs. Behind her, not a single person in the crowd made a sound. Cinder lifted its head, looked at the doorway full of watching faces, and then turned and pressed its nose gently against Grant's arm. And still, nobody said a word. The high tender did not speak for a long time after Grant's answer. She stood in the doorway of the alcove with the warm cedar smell drifting past her and the quiet sounds of 3 sleeping flameborn filling the small space, and she looked at the human sitting on the floor with his back against the wall and his hand resting gently on Spark, and something in her expression shifted. Not dramatically. Not in the loud and visible way that emotions moved across human faces. It was small and deep, like a change in the light when a cloud moves, something you would miss if you were not paying attention. She turned to the crowd behind her and said something in formal Vrethkai that Grant could not fully follow. The crowd stirred. Several of the council members exchanged long looks. One of the flameborn keepers in the grey robes pressed a hand to his chest in a gesture Grant had never seen before. Commander Seville, standing to the side of the doorway, watched the high tender without blinking. The high tender turned back to Grant. She told him that the elder council would need to meet. She told him to stay where he was and to keep the flameborn calm. She said it in a tone that was not unkind but left no room for question. Then she stepped back from the doorway and the crowd parted for her, and she walked away down the corridor with that unhurried and absolute stillness that seemed to belong only to her. The crowd did not leave entirely. Several officers remained in the corridor outside the alcove, watching through the open door with expressions Grant could not read. He did not look at them for long. He kept his attention on the 3 flameborn, who had been unsettled by the crowd and the noise and needed him to be steady. Spark had not gone back to sleep. It sat upright on his lap, watching the doorway with careful eyes. Ash had moved closer, pressing against Grant's right side. Cinder had lifted itself fully and was sitting with its back straight, scales bright, alert but not aggressive. Grant kept his hand on Spark and his breathing slow and said nothing. After a while the flameborn began to settle again. Spark lowered itself back down across his lap. Ash relaxed against his side. Cinder watched the doorway for a little longer, then turned and curled close to Grant's left leg and was still. The officers in the corridor watched all of this without speaking. Grant did not know how long the Elder Council met. It felt like a long time. He sat on the floor of the alcove and the warmth of the 3 flameborn moved through him in slow and steady waves and he thought about nothing in particular. He was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. The 10 days of quiet management, the careful hiding, the daily calculations of what to say and what not to say, all of it had cost him more than he had noticed while it was happening. Now that it was over he could feel the weight of it settling down through him. He was not sorry for any of it. He wanted to be clear with himself about that. He was not sorry. Commander Seville appeared in the doorway near midday. Her patterns were slower now than they had been all week, something Grant had not seen from her before. She looked at him with an expression that had something careful and considered in it. She told him the Elder Council had reached a decision. She told him the High Tender would return shortly to address him directly. She paused, and then she said one more thing that she did not have to say, something outside the boundaries of her formal report. She said that in 30 years of service she had never seen a young flameborn sleep on a stranger. Not once. She said it quietly and without decoration and then she stepped back from the doorway and stood to the side. The High Tender returned with the full Elder Council behind her. They filled the corridor in a long and formal line, their amber patterns moving in the slow and ceremonial rhythm that Grant had only seen once before, at an official station commemoration several months ago. It meant something important was being marked. Something that was meant to be remembered. The high tender stood at the doorway and addressed Grant in careful and measured words, speaking slowly enough that he could follow most of it, filling in what he missed with tone and intention. She told him that in the entire recorded history of the Vrethkai people, the title of Flamekeeper had never been given to anyone outside their kind. It was not simply a title, she said. It was a bond. It meant that the Flameborn who had chosen him were his responsibility and his honor, and that he was answerable to their well-being for as long as that bond lasted. It was not given lightly. It had never been given to a human. It had never been considered. She told him the Elder Council had voted. The vote had not been close. She told him that from this day, he carried the title of Flamekeeper, and that Cinder, Ash, and Spark were under his care by sacred recognition of the Vrethkai collective. She reached into the fold of her formal robe and produced a narrow band of copper, the same deep warm metal as the one on her own wrist, and she held it out to him. Grant got up slowly from the floor, careful not to disturb the three Flameborn more than necessary. He stood before the high tender and held out his left wrist. She placed the copper band around it without ceremony, simply and directly, and it was warm against his skin in a way that the metal alone could not account for. The Elder Council behind her pressed their hands to their chests in the gesture Grant had seen earlier from the keeper in the grey robe. All of them. At the same time. He did not know what to say. So he said thank you, simply and quietly, and the high tender looked at him with those slow and ancient patterns moving across her face and gave him a single nod. Grant went back to work that afternoon. It was the only thing that felt right to do. He picked up his tool bag, which Spark immediately tried to climb into, and made his way to the relay junction in Corridor 9 that had been waiting for 3 days. He sat on the floor in front of the open panel with his tools spread beside him and worked through the repair with steady and careful hands. Spark sat on top of the tool bag and watched him with bright curious eyes. Ash lay stretched across the corridor behind him, its wings spread lazily to one side. Cinder pressed its warm side against Grant's leg and stayed there, its scales glowing a quiet and contented amber in the dim light of the maintenance corridor. Grant tightened the connection, checked the reading, and moved to the next one. The copper band on his wrist caught the light when he reached into the panel. He noticed it and then went back to his work without stopping. Word traveled the way important things always travel, quietly at first and then all at once. It moved through Ember Reach and then outward through the communication channels that connected the stations and ships and outposts of dozens of species across that part of the galaxy. The story changed slightly with each telling, the way stories always do. But the core of it stayed the same because the core of it was simple and true and the kind of thing that does not need decoration to land with weight. A human technician had found 3 lost and frightened creatures. He had not called for help. He had not stepped back. He had sat down on the floor in the dark and made sure they were not afraid, and he had kept doing that, day after day, until they were ready to trust. People who heard the story responded to different parts of it. Some were struck by the Vrethkai decision, the historic weight of a title given across species lines for the first time. Some were struck by the image of 3 fire beasts sleeping peacefully on a man who had no training, no rank, and no particular reason to care. But the ones who understood it most deeply were struck by the simplest part of all. The part that happened before anything else. The part where Grant set a sandwich on the floor, stepped back, and waited. Not because he knew it would work. Not because he expected anything in return. But because something was frightened and hurting and he was there, and that was enough of a reason. Across the galaxy, in the slow and spreading way that true things spread, that was what people remembered about humanity. Not the wars. Not the weapons. Not the long and complicated history of everything humans had built and broken and built again. Just that. The stubborn and quiet and unshakable instinct to stay.